Sounds good. Good up there? Hi, good morning, friends. Welcome back. There's coffee in the back, restrooms and other things, but we're just really glad that everyone is back here with us on site and also online. My name is Jeremy Rutledge, and I'm senior pastor here at Circular Church. Some of you know I've still had a little dizziness, so my piece is recorded, but just really glad you're here. And my colleague, the Reverend Evelyn Oliveira, will help us get started with a few logistics as we begin.
Good morning. As Jeremy said, my name is Evelyn Oliveira, and I am the associate pastor here at Circular. And it is so good to see some faces that were here last night and some new faces. At Circular, we say, whoever you are and wherever you are on your journey, you are welcome here. So we're so glad that you chose to come and be with us this Saturday morning. We thank you for wearing masks. We try to make our gatherings as inclusive as possible and as accessible as possible. So for us, wearing a mask is a way to create space for those who are the most vulnerable in our communities to feel comfortable coming and sitting next to you. So thank you for doing that. If you need one, there are some in the back. And we do realize that there's eating and drinking on the other side of the green curtain. We just ask that you keep your mask on this side and just take it off when you go on that side. Some logistical items. We have restrooms also behind the green curtains on the right. And if that one's taken, there are some downstairs under the stairs in Lance Hall, which is the light-colored building, two-story building to our left as you go out the doors. If you ever need a mask break or some water, there's also, you can do that behind the curtain. And our morning is going to be shaped a lot like last night. If you were here last night, we're going to have a lecture, and then a question and response session, and then we will have a light reception and book table behind the green curtains afterwards. We enjoyed last night so much, and so many of us either couldn't sleep or woke up thinking about Professor Glaude's words. So we are so excited to once again be here. And Francis, if you will cue up the welcome from Jeremy.
Good morning, friends. My name is Jeremy Rutledge, and I'm senior minister here at Circular Congregational Church, and it is my delight to welcome you back to the second of this year's spring lectures in theology and ethics with Professor Eddie Glaude. This morning's introduction will be brief. For the longer version, you may revisit last evening's lecture, but we still must begin with thanks to the Circular Church Endowment Board for underwriting these lectures so that they may be free and open to all. Thanks to Catherine, Susan, Francis, Skip, and many others on the Circular team. Thanks to Shonda, Holly, and Eddie's team. Thanks to you for joining us on a Saturday morning. And thanks to Eddie for traveling here to be with us. We invited Eddie this weekend to inform and inspire our work for justice in the Low Country. In his own life and work, Eddie has drawn from so many who have gone before in the freedom struggle. And this morning, as we do our work together, I'd like to lift up the name of one such person, an ancestor, one who went before, one who has gone largely unrecognized until recently. Rolla Bennett was an enslaved Black man who was a member of this church. He joined with Denmark Vesey, a free Black man, and others in planning an uprising to fight for the freedom of Black Charlestonians. The plan was uncovered, and Rolla, Denmark, and the others were executed for it. The pastor of this church at the time preached that enslaved people should fulfill their roles obediently and not cause any trouble. But today, we shall not call that pastor's name. He was as wrong in his time as he would be in ours. Instead, we will lift up the name of Rolla Bennett, and we gather in his spirit and the spirit of all the other freedom fighters from Charleston's past and present, people like Rolla, Septima, Ruby, Millicent, Muhyiddin, and Eddie. It's not overstating it to add Eddie's name to the list or to add our own names if we are serious about giving ourselves to the struggle. But today, may we do that. May we give ourselves as fully as they did to the cause of equality, dignity, and justice for all. Eddie S. Glaude, Jr. is the James S. McDonald Distinguished University Professor at Princeton University. He is a frequent contributor to Morning Joe and other popular programs on MSNBC. He is the author of many books and articles, including most recently, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and its urgent lessons for our own. Friends, we are so fortunate to have him back with us. Will you join me in welcoming our friend and teacher, Professor Eddie Glaude.
Thank you, Jeremy, for that amazing introduction. I want to thank all the members of Circular, all the team, for all the work that you've done over the last couple of days, over the last week or so to make this possible. It's great to see you, Sister Sarah. Great to see you again, Sister Evelyn. To be here, to see many of you again. It's wonderful. Rolla Bennett, to call his name in this place, at this time, oh, what a roaring, as Tony would say. So this is in honor of that legacy, dedicated to that piece of knowledge that I did not have before I walked into this sanctuary. At the end of Imani Perry's extraordinary book, Breathe, A Letter to My Sons, she describes her love of Easter. This comes on the heels of a beautiful account of the challenges her boys will face in a world such as ours, as well as her gentle and loving effort to hand over to them the beauty and power of our inheritances. We are more than objects of racism, she tells them. Our lives are more than the wreckage and ruins left over after the plunder. She insists they tend to their interior lives, sit with their fears, and imagine themselves in the most expansive of terms. Grace makes room for this. Follow your yearnings, she instructs. Take time to strip yourselves down to the core, to the simplest of joys. It is a ritual of reorientation, she says, a steadying, a sense of grace, end quote. And do so, she seems to suggest, in the full light of a tradition in the full light of an inheritance that is the wind beneath your wings. She begins the book with a response in part to the all too familiar American refrain that, quote, "It must be terrifying to raise a black boy in America." And with the first sentence, an echo really of W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, and a refutation, to be sure, of the celebration of Ta-Nehisi Coates's Between the World and Me. She announces her response to such fears, quote, "Between me and these others who utter the sentence, the indelicate assertion hangs midair. Without hesitation, they speculate as if it is a statement of fact. I look into their wide eyes. I see them hungry for my suffering, or crude with sympathy, or grateful they are not in such circumstance. Sometimes they're even curious. It makes my blood boil, my mind furnace hot. I seldom answer a word," end quote. Hers is a different scene of instruction. We are not reducible to our circumstance, she tells her children. We, you, are more than the hatred that threatens to consume. But it is the end of the book that draws my attention this morning. Again, she declares Easter as a favorite holiday, not Christmas. She recalls singing, "He arose with the mighty triumph over foes. He arose a victor from the dark domain, and he lives forever with his saints to reign." This is the culmination of all that she wants to give to her boys, a kind of resilience and grit, an inheritance that equips them to face the storms because the storms are always coming. She says to her babies, who are no longer excited about Easter because they're big, you know? They're no longer excited about the Easter baskets and dressing in seersucker and linen. She says to them that, quote, "I will keep taking you to Mass because I know you will need it, even if not precisely in this way. In the wake of all this death, the eternal spring." Something in the wake of all this death, the eternal spring. It reminds me of that moment in Baldwin's essay, Nothing Personal, quote, "I have been, as the song says, buked and scorned. I know that I always will be, but my God, in that darkness, which was the lot of my ancestors, in my own state, what a mighty fire burned. In that darkness of rape and degradation, that fine flying froth in midst of blood, through all that terror and all that helplessness, a living soul moved and refused to die," end quote. That confrontation with madness that we talked about yesterday evening demands something of us, something more. Something rooted in a heritage that belongs to all of us, that eternal spring. And this isn't a guarantee. I'm not talking about a guarantee that all will be well, that in the end, darkness will give to light. Spring always comes, but so does winter. Here, Perry guides the eyes of her sons to what's possible, to the as yet. And that becomes the basis for a different kind of imagining, what she calls a revolutionary possibility. We are more than our circumstances. We are more than what the world says about us. Just look at how we got over. Now this term, this semester, I taught my seminar on James Baldwin's nonfiction again. The last time I taught it, Donald Trump was running for office. This time I'm teaching it in the moment when the fever dreams have spiked. And as usual, as typical in the seminar, we began with notes of a native son, read closely, "Nobody knows my name," and "The fire next time," "Set with no name in the street," and ended with "The evidence of things not seen." And in between, we read fugitive essays and speeches and interviews, even the last interview just a month before his death. In all the years of my reading and teaching Baldwin, this time, in this moment, I noticed something different. And here is an extension of last night's lecture. I notice something different, that a kind of madness shadows the page. Baldwin struggles to hold himself together. And I'm not simply referring to the several suicide attempts that defined his life, right? And I'm not simply referring to those attempts. That much is evident. I'm talking about his manic attempts to keep himself together in the face of a maddening world. The madness that I attributed to the country last evening touches each of us, especially those who have to bear the brunt of it all. I suppose all this came into view because, to be honest with you, behind my smile, but just a moment to pause and look into my eyes, you will probably see that I'm not quite right. Grief and death saturate this place. And because of the demand of capital, we haven't had time to tend to the broken pieces. COVID. People we loved didn't die right. And where I'm from, on the coast of Mississippi, where magnolia trees bloom, cypress trees cast shadows on bayous. Where I'm from, when people don't die right, they don't stay in the ground. They haunt. COVID. And of course, there's the anger and the hatred. The country seems haunted. The ghosts have us by the throat, using our own hands to take our breath away. And because of my presence on television, I have to bear witness to it all every single day. Just this morning, 5 people are dead in Texas. Another mass shooting. And sometimes I want to scream at the top of my lungs. And the maddening part, of course, is the repetition. Having to bear witness to the same thing over and over and over again. Wash, rinse, and repeat. I know intimately what Baldwin meant in his last interview when he said, quote, "You are a broken motor. You're repeating, and it causes a breakdown," he says, lessening of the will of power, lessening of willpower, and sooner or later your will gives out. It has to, he says. And you're lucky if it is a physical matter, because it could have been mental. I know what he meant. At least now I do. We're not quite right. Now, when my students this year read the essay Notes of a Native Son, I was prepared to talk about Jimmy's vexed relationship to his father. Ready to profess my own vexed relationship with my own dad. Ready to talk about how Baldwin aligns his father's death, the 1943 Harlem riots, and the birth of his sister in this marvelous parable about the perils of the nation and the difficulties of self-creation. And if my dad is watching this, I love you to death, Pops. But what hit me squarely in the face this time, and unlike the August summer heat of Charleston, I'm going to reference the August summer heat of Mississippi. Suffocating heat. Right? That humidity will wear you out. And what hit me squarely in the face, like the humidity of a Mississippi summer, was the prevalence of madness in the piece. In fact, I've come to read this essay, Notes of a Native Son, as a meditation on madness. Of course, there's the madness of the nation that refuses to know itself and creates a world in such a way to avoid confrontation with that refusal. And the consequences for those who bear the brunt of that refusal are brutal. Baldwin's stepfather illustrates that. And we're forced to live with the idea that because of the color of our skin and because of the color of yours, that somehow that says something about our value and about our worth. And we have to move mountains to keep that insidious idea from taking hold in our guts. Eventually, Baldwin's stepfather would be, quote, locked up in his terrors, as Jimmy put it, where the disease, quote, of his mind allowed the disease of his body to destroy him, end Baldwin's stepfather believed what the world said about him, and as a result, he lived, quote, and died in an intolerable bitterness of spirit. And Baldwin confesses really, that bitterness had in fact become his own. That the bitterness had become his own. He tells the story of a moment in New Jersey on Route 1, right down the street from Princeton University, where with a friend he entered a diner for the fourth or fifth time perhaps, waiting to be served, only to be ignored and then told by the waitress that, quote, "We don't serve Negroes," end quote. Blinded with rage, Baldwin hurls a glass at the waitress's head, only to shatter the mirror behind the bar. And this scene is prefaced by a description of his state of mind. Quote, "I first contracted some dread chronic disease, the unfailing symptoms of which is a kind of blind fever, a pounding in the skull and fire in the bowels," end quote. The madness of his father against the backdrop of a mad world is now his own, and this Bildungsroman, this coming-of-age story that is a Notes of a Native Son, reveals the depth of that madness and what is needed to break the fever, to break free. He had to run for his life. He had to run away from America. He had to leave this place in order to vomit all that was deposited in his gut up. One has to let go of the hatred that fuels the rage, Baldwin writes. And here the hatred is directed towards the nation and towards the stepfather. But he says of his father, quote, "I had hated him and I wanted to hold on to this hatred. I did not want to look on him as a ruin. It was not a ruin I had hated. I imagine that one of the reasons people cling to their hatreds so stubbornly is because they sense once hatred is gone, they then will be forced to deal with pain. Once the hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain." And as Baldwin prepared to bury his father, to bury the man who caused him so much anguish, he confronted the aftermath of the riots. Quote, "That bleakly memorable morning," he writes, "I hated the unbelievable streets and the Negroes and whites who had equally made them that way, but I knew that it was folly." Remember, folly is a form of madness. That's Erasmus in praise of folly, right? "I knew that it was folly." As my father would have said, this bitterness was folly. It was necessary to hold on to the things that mattered. The dead man mattered. Our dead matter. The new life mattered. Blackness and whiteness did not matter. To believe that they did was to acquiesce in one's own destruction. Hatred could destroy so much, never failed to destroy the man who hated. And this was an immutable law. Hatred could destroy so much, which could destroy so much, never failed to destroy the person who hated. And this was immutable law. Our dead matter. Can you imagine? Jeremy and I were talking about this yesterday. Over 1 million plus dead. And we're moving about as if it doesn't matter. Where are our national rituals of grief? Think about all of the anniversaries of death that are happening right now because of the same thing. And you combine it with the anger and the hatred and what we see and what we experience. Think about all the things that we have to endure, all the things that we have to endure as hatred seems to overwhelm and overrun everything. You know this in South Carolina. Hatred, which can destroy so much, corrodes and corrupts the soul. And for Baldwin, as I read him here, the path to the other side of madness involves accepting the world for what it is, to not be naive about the failings and beauty of men and women, to not fall privy to the sirens who sing of race and its enchanting fantasies, but to fight with all your strength against the injustices of the world and what that evil has placed inside of you. Two things: accept the world for what it is, not naively. Accept the world for what it is, and to fight with all your strength against the injustices in that world and the evil that has been deposited in you. Now, of course, Baldwin's view will evolve. I write about this in Begin Again, and it's on sale right outside past. No, I'm just kidding. To reference that consumerist ethic, right? Of course, his view will evolve. This is early Baldwin, Notes of a Native Son. He's a young man. He's still in his 20s. He hasn't witnessed yet the murder of Medgar Evers, the assassination of Malcolm and Martin. He hasn't seen the country turn its back on all of those young people who risked everything in the bowels of the South to get the country to live up to its creed. But the rage in his blood he had identified in 1955, bless you. The rage in his blood he identified in 1955, that blind fever kept coming back until the day he took his last breath. Why? Why? Because these people want to be white still in order to justify the slaughter, in order to justify the crime. Now, what must we do in the face of this bleak picture? How might we imagine a new America and keep the madness at bay? What might I mean by America's salvation? The late historian Vincent Harding asked the question, is America possible? Is America possible? And he claimed that the answer could be found in those unwritten stories I talked about last night. Right? But Harding wants us also to understand something more fundamental as the ground for our imagination. Not only those unwritten stories, that vernacular space where democracy is vibrant, where the kind of categories of race do not get in the way of our living together. And we see it in our popular forms. We hear it in the sounds that make up this place, right? We're not talking about that. He also wants us to understand something more fundamental as the ground for our imagining. And here he reaches for Langston Hughes. Just a stanza. Oh, let America be America again. The land that never has been yet, and yet must be, the land where every man is free. The land that never has been yet. Ellison would say, as I said last night, that America has yet to discover itself, and that the tricky magic seeks to mask that fact, right? Baldwin would make a similar point, as I said last night, about the price of the ticket. But Harding's answer to the question rests with the imagination. The dream makers vested with the sacrifice of those who have struggled for a more just world. America is possible if we imagine it so. America is possible if we imagine it so. Harding writes, quote, I hear all the heroic voices of struggle joining Hughes in a common message. It says loudly that the work of discovering, the work of exploring and developing this true America is our work. We, the people, are in charge, end quote. This work of the moral imagination is critical to the task that has fallen into our hands. Thinking right now, the quotation from Frantz Fanon comes to mind. Each generation out of relative obscurity must discover its mission, fulfill it or betray it. It's in our hands, as Toni Morrison said in her Nobel lecture to those young people who are trying to imagine what's their charge. This work of the moral imagination is critical to the task that's in front of us. Moral imagination can be thought of in a number of ways. The scholar David Bromwich offers a compelling genealogy of the phrase, which traces its emergence in the words of Edmund Burke, its use in the poems of Wordsworth and Shelley, to its enactment in the witness of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Bromwich powerfully emphasizes that feature of moral imagination, which insists that, quote, justice to a stranger comes to seem a more profound work of conscience than justice to a friend. than justice to a neighbor or a member of our own community, end quote. For him, and I believe Bromwich is right here, the use of moral imagination is to gauge the, quote, self-deception that intervenes when in the apparent service of high-minded aims we come to describe our appetites as needs, end quote. Moral imagination serves as a source of resistance to self-deception. When our manners or our habits or of self-regard warp our conduct towards others, we think we're being decent when in fact you know you're not. You think you're virtuous when in fact you are drowning in vice. When you think you're committed to justice when in fact, right, you're engaged in philanthropic gestures and charitable enterprises. You're not fundamentally changing the order of things. You have conceded to the world as it is. When our manners or our habits of self-regard warp our conduct towards others. One of the most dangerous features of our current political moment is the toxic combination of hatred and greed and selfishness. Hatred and greed and selfishness leads to a kind of indifference that allows us to what? Be okay in the midst of suffering. To be fine with the world as it is, as long as your world is okay. But for my purposes here, there's much more to be said about that. But for my purposes this morning, Bromwich distinguishes one of the two important dimensions of moral imagination. Imagination as an act of sympathy or empathy. The philosopher John Dewey maintained in his Ethics that, quote, a person entirely lacking in sympathetic response might have a keen, calculating intellect, but he would have no spontaneous sense of the claims of others for satisfaction of their desires. He goes on to say that, quote, a person of narrow sympathy is of necessity a person of confined outlook upon the scene of human good, to put ourselves in the place of others, to see things from the standpoint of their purposes and values, to humble our own pretensions and claims till they reach the level they would assume in the eye of an impartial, sympathetic observer, is the surest way to attain objectivity of moral knowledge. He says, sympathy is the animating mold of moral judgment. Sympathy is the animating mold of moral judgment. This aspect of the imagination, that the standing of others draws us beyond ourselves into the orbit of the aspiration, interest, and fears of others, is necessary but not sufficient for moral judgment. Imagination also involves our capacity to see the possibilities interwoven within the texture of the actual, to glimpse the as yet. So we need to be sympathetic because sympathy, what? Draws us out of ourselves and draws us toward another. It's critical for the imagination to work, right? What happens to us when you see Tamir Rice and you think you see a 21-year-old? What has happened to us when you open your door and you see a 16-year-old and you see a 6'2", hulking, threatening black man and you shoot him in the head as he's just trying to find his brothers on 115th Street and Terrace, but he goes to 115th Street instead. Sympathy allows us to sympathy draws us out of ourselves toward the other, but that's not sufficient. It's necessary. Imagination also involves our capacity to see the possibilities interwoven within the texture of the actual, to glimpse the as yet. It is, as I said last night to echo Shelley, the chief instrument of the good. Imagination guides our attention beyond the immediately experienced so that we can take heed of those lessons of the past as we take in those as yet realized possibilities that attend any problematic situation. It is in this sense that the imagination, in my view, acquires its prophetic quality, that the sense of the as yet realized possibility that may indeed be realized, in contrast to the actual conditions of our living, can be the basis of criticism of current social and political arrangements, and perhaps more importantly, can be the basis of a passionate creation of the self, a passionate creation of a world beyond the confines and strictures of the world we presently inhabit. In short, we must be able to Imagine America, in America that is not yet been discovered, has not yet been discovered, an America that is not yet in existence. We must be able to imagine it anew if it is to be saved. The two components, right? Imagination as sympathy, which draws us out of ourselves toward another. And the imagination that allows us to see beyond the opacity of our current condition, to imagine an as yet that then orients us critically to the world as it is in pursuit of the world as it could be. Did you hear that? I hope you did. In 1957, I said I was going to go shorter. Here I am going longer and longer. I'm sorry. It's too early in the morning to be talking like this, right? I hope we all had our coffee. In 1957, with the challenges of a dawning age that required recognition of a shrinking world, and that globalization had produced what Dr. Martin Luther King called a geographical togetherness, this togetherness very much needed a spiritual grounding where our moral and spiritual genius would make possible a beloved community. Dr. King insisted that this new age required of us a commitment to excellence and an understanding goodwill, that the virtues of love, mercy, and forgiveness ought to stand at the center of our lives. A world so fallen by the tragic choices of finite creatures like ourselves called for reconciliation, King argued. But it also had need of redemption such that a beloved community could actually come into being. King understood that in a moment of challenge and crisis, in those darkest of hours, the dawning of a new age is only made possible by those who would imagine that new age. Imaginings that would broaden our horizons, enlarge our experience, and enable us to leave older selves behind. Not those who would rest on a blessed assurance. Not those who would assume that everything will be taken care of in the end. Those who want to run past Saturday to Resurrection Sunday. Not those who believe that everything will be taken care of in the end. King understood that any new age obliged us to work. As he said in 1957, quote, "I've talked about the new age which is fastly coming into being. I've talked about the fact that God is working in history to bring about this new age. There is the danger, therefore, that after hearing all of this, you will go away with the impression that we can go home, sit down, and do nothing, waiting for the coming of the inevitable. You will somehow feel that this new age will roll in on the wheels of inevitability, so there is nothing to do but wait on it. If you get that impression, you are victims of an illusion wrapped in superficiality," King said. "We must speed up the coming of the inevitable," he said, end quote. Imagining a better world is not a passive act. It is a readying of the self to engage courageously and intelligently, to act prophetically for transformative action. Such readying or tending involves practices that shape our disposition towards others. A caring of the soul that opens up to the wounds and joys of others, forging habits that enable us to be suspicious of actions that deny the dignity of our fellows, and a willingness to be still as a pathway to address the white noise of our current living. Those features are cultivated in our daily lives, readying us for the moments in which courage and risk are needed. I'm reminded of a conversation I had with the late Bob Moses. We've lost so many giants. He talked about the ethic of caring within SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that each member had decided to hold him or herself accountable to the responsibility of tending to people who were invisible to the larger society, of tending in such a way that they, poor black sharecroppers, could become who they were capable of being. I'm thinking about Miss Ella Baker when dementia had taken away her ability to recognize certain folk. But whenever she met someone, the first question she would ask is, "Who's your people?" Trying to locate them in a community, trying to get a sense of who tended to them, and for them to give an account of the wind beneath their wings, the inheritances that make us possible. This understanding, right, of imagining a better world as an active disposition, as a readying or tending, which involves practices that shape our dispositions toward others. This understanding of the imagination. Remember, hatred gums it all up. Hatred gums up matters. It blocks the way towards others. It straitjackets the imagination and places us all behind iron bars. Baldwin understood this, just as Dr. King did. And I find that insight in the tradition rightly understood that Imani Perry commends to her babies. That's the insight that blooms in spring. Baldwin wrote in Search of a Majority that to be with God, quote, is really to be involved with some enormous, overwhelming desire. To be with God is really to be involved with some enormous, overwhelming desire and joy and power which you cannot control. To be with God is really involved with some enormous, overwhelming desire and joy and power which you cannot control, which controls you. I conceive, he says, of my own life as a journey towards something I do not understand. Going towards makes me better. I conceive of my life as a journey towards something I do not understand, which in the going towards makes me better. It is in the going towards that salvation can be found. That imaginative leap that allows us to see beyond ourselves and to reach for another, to love, to be vulnerable, to rip off the mask that blinds us to the beauty of the human being right in front of us. It is in the going towards that salvation is found. To recognize the distorting and disfiguring effect of hate and the exacting power of love. Salvation isn't going to be found in policy. Of course, policy matters. Policy is a reflection of the values to which we're committed. If you want to understand America's values, just look at its policing. If you want to understand what we're committed to, just look at the prisons. If you want to understand how we conceive of the good, just look at the social safety net that doesn't exist. Salvation isn't limited to policy. Salvation must be found in our relationship to each other, in that disposition that what takes us outside of ourselves, and it is in the going towards that love is manifest. Y'all following me? I'm about to start preaching it. It's in the exacting power of hate. Salvation is found in the exacting power of love. And however, no matter how vague the invocation of love may be, however vague the invocation of love may be, it remains the one force that transcends the differences that get in the way of our genuinely living together. If you can't see a child as a child, if you can't see a child as a child, where the color of one's skin blinds you to the beauty and innocence of that child, something has gone wrong in you. You have lost something in you. In one of his last essays, To Crush a Serpent, published in 1987, Baldwin recounts his journey with and through religion, and along the way, casts aside the hypocrisy of white evangelicals like the moral majority. He knows what it means, Baldwin knows. He knows what it means to predicate a sense of self and national identity upon hatreds, upon fears and grievances. The flames of such fears and the scapegoats that must bear the burden of hatreds are meant to, quote, exercise the terrors of the mob, end quote. As Baldwin put it, quote, those ladders to fire, excuse my language here, I'm quoting him. Those ladders to fire, the burning of the witch, the heretic, the Jew, the nigger, the faggot, have always failed to redeem or even to change in any way whatever the mob. They merely force their connection on the only plane on which the mob can meet. The charred bones connect its members and give them reason to speak to one another. The charred bones are the sum total of their individual self-hatred. Externalized, the burning or lynching or torturing gives them something to talk about. They dare no other subject, certainly not the forbidden subject of the blood-stained self. They dare not trust one another. It's Baldwin's rendering of the scapegoat that we talked about last night. What does it mean that we're awash in hatred? What does it mean that we're awash in fear? What does it mean that we're awash in grievance? There is a sense in which the incoherence of the nation is being felt viscerally, and now we need blood. What are we to do? Salvation is not found in such tricky magic. It's not found in that alchemy which transforms fears and hatreds into scapegoats and eases the pain and fear of a nation still uncertain about who and what it is, as I said last night. Salvation is not flight from the wrath of God, Baldwin says. Salvation is not flight from the wrath of God. It is accepting and reciprocating the love of God. Salvation is not separation. It is the beginning of the union with all that is or has been or will ever be. Salvation is found in the going towards. It is found in the going towards, and love is its carriage. Oftentimes we are looking for answers when the answer is right at the tip of your nose, right at the tip of your fingers. The answer isn't complex. How do we imagine an America in which the values that animate our being together are rooted in a notion of love as opposed to hate and fear and greed and selfishness and indifference? Salvation is found in the going towards, and love is its carriage. The question of who we are as a nation can only be answered if we run towards our fears. We cannot hide from each other. We can no longer be imprisoned by categories that cut off the humanity of others from our own. And that's not an appeal to some empty, sentimentalist notion of the universal human being. The condition for my being in the United States can never be that I must leave the particularity of who I am at the door. Oftentimes, I know I'm going on for a minute, but oftentimes the condition for my entree into American life is that I have to leave the particularity of who I am at the door. I have to wash my face blank, as Baldwin says in Many Thousands Gone, in order to wash away your guilt. But why would I leave that inheritance at the door? Why would I ignore the advice that Imani Perry is giving to her babies? Because that's the armor that protects me in the storm. But you know what? That inheritance is yours too. It offers an insight in what it might mean to be fully human. It offers an insight in what it means to cultivate that disposition of going towards the other. It offers an example of an imaginative work, an imaginative leap beyond the ugliness and brutality of one's condition. It gives us example of what it means to imagine humanity, right, in the most expansive of terms. The question of who we are can only be answered in running towards our fears. We can no longer imprison people in the categories that cut us off from each other. Those categories only make us monstrous. We have to run towards the trouble that makes us afraid of life. We have to choose life. We have to choose life. We're swamped, drowning in a country that's choosing death every day. The question of who we're going to be as a nation, the question of is America possible, the daunting task of America's salvation has never before been so critically bound up with the moral choice. The moral choice in accepting the beauty and ugliness of who we are and in communion with each other. There, in making a decision to choose wise. There, in love, a new America can be found. This is my hope. This is my prayer. An eternal spring. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Oh, we're going to get the rules now.
Yes, we do. And just like the masks, we do it for a reason, because we want everyone to be able to participate and have an opportunity to ask a question if they have one. So if you were here last night, well, before we do that, I do want to just take 2 breaths, because I don't think we can begin to absorb what we have heard, but I want to acknowledge and mark it with silence that we have heard some prophetic teaching. And so let us take just a couple of breaths before we begin. So some of you last night heard me introduce our question and response time by talking about 5 different types of questions or comments that get made. And I will try to make these brief today because a lot of you were here last night. But the first type of question is someone telling a story, but that's not a question. I had a retired first grade teacher tell me last night that what I read is what she would tell her first grade class. That's not a question. So the second example is the participant has a thought for the speaker or the group's consideration. Still not a question. The third example is actually a question, just a simple, thought-through question. The fourth is a combination of the first 2 or 3 with a story and then a question, and it takes up a lot of time. And the last one is just a jumble, and then with the ending of, I don't really know what my question is. So we want you to trust your question, that your questions matter without the preambles. So, in having said that, please don't be afraid to ask a question. But if you do have a question, raise your hand and I will bring you the microphone.
See Virginia's hand right there.
Mm.
Okay, Evelyn, I'm going to try. In our so-called democracy, this hate so far is allowed. The violence is allowed. Our voices are not heard. Do we, in opposition, does it get to the point we need to arm ourselves? Is it going to come to that? Eddie, you yourself, I hope I can say, have said you've had to protect yourself. We are insulating ourselves. As I speak with my friends, I can say from my position, we're becoming afraid. Mm-hmm. What do we do, actually?
Yeah, you know, as I said last night, Virginia, we have to be as aggressive in defending the world we want as they are in fighting for the world they desire. Doesn't mean that we have to suddenly start NRA chapters. right? Because let me put it this way, the means by which you fight for the New Jerusalem, right, will determine the content of the world that comes into being. If you don't do it with love, if you don't do it with democratic commitments and values, you'll end up with Mugabe. Right? So how you fight, how you struggle matters, right? But you have to fight and you have to struggle. See, our problem, and see, this is what we don't want to admit. If we looked at the Venn diagram, right? You have those who are willing to fight for an authoritarian world. And you have those who are willing to fight for for lack of a better word, a progressive world, a just world. Then you have those people in the middle who are indifferent. And their indifference actually joins with the forces of the autocratic world, the authoritarian world. Their silence becomes complicit with those darker forces. So if you choose to hide in your silos, if you choose to protect what you have worked so hard for, if you believe that the zero-sum game is the only way to understand our living together, then you have actually made a choice. You've already made a choice. What does it mean? What does it mean to be a border state in the context of the Civil War? What does it mean not to be an abolitionist in the context of slavery? What does it mean not to say anything about Jim Crow in the context of the 1920s, 30s, 40s in South Carolina? It meant that you were complicit with those sets of arrangements. And you have to admit it, right? We have to admit it. And so part of our challenge, Virginia, I think, is that we have to muster all of the energy we can to pop these people back in the mouth. Figuratively. Right? Because we have to do it for our babies. Our babies. Right? That's why my baby, who's 6'2" now, but we have to do it for our babies. And if we don't fight, they're going to win. And you know what? I'll say this really quickly because I know we got another question. It happened before. Here we have Reconstruction, this extraordinary attempt in human history to build a multiracial democracy, to take this former population of slaves and bring them into the body politic, right? We get our modern notions of citizenship. We get the modern U.S. nation state that comes about as a result of the Civil War amendments. And what did we get in response? And how long did it take us to respond to it? From the moment, right, there was an effort to radical reconstruction, there was an effort to dismantle it, and then it wasn't addressed until 1954. We've only been a multiracial democracy, we've only attempted to be a multiracial democracy since 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. Prior to that moment, we weren't. Period. Right? So we got to fight for that world as aggressively. That doesn't mean we got to get AR-15s. I want to ban those damn things. I'm not in the pulpit, so I can say that. Right? Yeah. But I'll say more as we continue. Thank you, Virginia. But you cannot hide in the suburbs because it's coming to you. In fact, it's coming from you, to be honest. All right? Yes. I know we had a hand right here.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
How does your knowledge that forward is a positive inform your daily living, such as your being a father and a husband and a commentator and a citizen of the world?
I have to be mindful of revolutionary possibility in the midst of the darkness, right? So, I grew up on the coast of Mississippi, so I know a little thing about hurricanes. And I remember when Trump lost, and I was like, yo, we're just in the eye of the hurricane. The tail's coming. The tail's coming. We have to prepare ourselves. We can go out and look at the damage, but let's not be fooled by the sunshine. The tail's coming. But even when the tail's coming, I have to say, well, we're going to have to go out. And so I'm always looking forward to that moment. But how can I put this? But the future is bound up with the past. As Faulkner would say, that was never was. So I'm constantly telling a story about a past and the choices that inform the past, that inform how I imagine the future in the now. Right? Because I'm always in this moment, in this present moment. So, possibility, the as yet, is the source of my prophetic voice. And the as yet is rooted in the imagination. I have to be able to imagine the world as it could be, as a ground for how I speak on television, how I speak to you. I have to imagine my baby as the man I'm trying to grow him into being. And now he is. I'm so proud of him. He wants to be a public defender. He's going to be broke, right? But here's this kid who experienced horrible encounters with the police. In his third year of law school at Berkeley, right? He's going to be a part of the death penalty clinic, representing folk on death row, sending me emails where a brief that he wrote got a cop thrown off the force in Oakland, right? Doing what he has been called to do. Something his mother must have put something in him, right? We cultivated the soil so that he'd grow into the rose that he is, right? That future, possible future, orients me to now. Does that make sense? Because if it was all just about right now, as I said last night, I would drink too much whiskey. Right? Or I wouldn't be able to survive. I would literally go mad. Right?
And I'm going to do my best.
And I'll be shorter with my answers, I promise.
As many individuals who haven't had a chance to ask a question as possible, but in order to include everyone, we have a question from online.
Sure.
Bill Epps asked, what is the role of poets in the national imagination and toward an eternal spring?
Absolutely. We talked about it last night, right? Baldwin, at the National Press Club, about a year before he died, said that our current political language cannot bear the weight of reality. Our current political language can't bear the weight of reality. And what we need are new words. When Baldwin says we have to crack open the American image and see what it hides and obscures, right? What does he mean? We have to do a kind of violence to language in order to free us to imagine ourselves together differently. We are stuck, right, with an understanding of our relationship to each other that has been defined by the age of Reagan. Some of you may be Reagan supporters. I don't care. But we're caught within that language. We're caught in that economic reality, right, which is a kind of hyper-individualized competition that, as I said last night, eviscerates any robust notion of the public good. Our responsibility to each other doesn't go beyond our kin, the folk we know, the people who are within our sphere of moral concern. We've narrowed the scope of our moral compass. Well, I don't want to say narrow. Our moral compass has been broken, right? And so what the poets offer us are new languages. And we're not just talking about people who write verse. The poet is you, is us. The prophetic is not how can I put it? By locating the prophetic in the imagination, That means we all have the capacity to be prophetic. We've just democratized it. It's not about someone on high coming down who's been sanctioned voice, who's the sanctioned voice of God. No, 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 no. The imagination is all of our possession. You see? So the poets offer us new language, right? They offer us a different language. And this is absolutely needed. I'm neither a Republican or a Democrat. I don't want to be either one. I'm often constrained by the political realities of the United States, and you have to make a choice. I am motivated by decency, by love, by moral precepts and commitments and values. That guides my political decision-making. And whether or not that is Republican or Democrat, I don't care. We need new languages. We need new vocabularies. And that's what the poets do. So they're absolutely essential. They don't even want us to imagine. Go ahead, find someone else. They don't even want us to imagine what could be. Because the first thing they tell you is that we're broke. We don't have enough money. Right? We don't have enough money for universal health care. And then we find all of that money to execute the Ukrainian war. Like, where did it all come from? Right? It's over and over again. Right? Yes, and we fall for the okie doke. Yes, ma'am. I see you, Delta.
Yes, very much so. Minerva King. I grew up in Charleston during the Civil Rights era, the 50s and 60s, being the daughter of a man who was state president of the NAACP, so we were right in the thick of it. We had many, many tools that were very effective during that time. I think the most viable, most effective tool was the economic boycott. It absolutely worked. The world is different now, obviously, and I think we're a lot more materialistic than we were back in the 50s and the 60s. How viable a tool do you see that economic boycott today?
I think it's, I think it's actually even more, it's even more potent, precisely because the economic has expanded in defining the substance of our lives, right? The question is how to do it under contemporary conditions. But because money is the superordinate value of our society, right? Think about what just happened to Bud Light, right? If we did it, and I say we, the people who are aligned politically with me, that would be called cancel culture, right? Wouldn't it? That would be a kind of offense, an affront to free market principles. But you see, again, there's liberty for them and authority for everyone else, right? So I think economic boycott, rightly understood or rightly executed, is definitely impactful, right? Just as I think wildcat walkouts or wildcat strikes, right? I'm waiting for America to engage in a general strike around assault weapons. I've called for it on national television, and I get, repeated blinks every time I do it. Why haven't we decided that until these people move, right, we're going to engage in a massive walkout that will stop the country? France, they have a general strike every other day, but you get the point, right? If we're not going to fight Virginia, you see how that's a fight? We want to get rid of AR-15s so they don't fall in the hands of 18-year-olds and people like that, right? We want common sense gun laws because we're all from the South. We know what some people, I've grew up with guns, right? In my dad's house, right? 8 gauges. I never knew an 8-gauge existed, right? I shot it and almost broke my damn shoulder. But anyway, right? So there are elements from past struggles that are continually, I think that remain effective tools, but we have to exercise them, right? Use them in light of our particular conditions. I was, for example, really unsettled when Representative Jones in Tennessee, right, locked arms and sang "We Shall Overcome" as he was walking into the State House. And so I sent Justin a text message, and I said, remember, 6 people are still dead. Approach this with the solemnity that you should. And the objective is not getting you to be seated in the house. The objective is to rid these guns that are killing folk. And so here you have this moment of them singing "We Shall Overcome," the spectacle of this nostalgia for the 1960s. And then he walks in and he puts up the Black Power fist, and I'm saying, somebody's confused, right? So how we reach for the resources of the past in our current moment is really important. We don't want to lock in our imaginations where the way in which we struggle has to be a mimicry of how you struggled in the 1950s and 60s. We could take the same tools, but we got to do it in light of our moment, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? I'm rambling a bit, yeah. We know we got some more questions.
Yes, I've seen 2 hands, and we may not get to any more.
I'll be quick, I promise. I'm telling fibs in church. Yes.
I have a simple, complicated, and childish question. How do we believe anything anybody says?
How do we believe anything anybody?
That we hear in the media and all the rest of it?
How do we believe anything anyway that we hear in the media, specifically? Yeah. Well, you certainly don't come to believe it by virtue of just hearing it immediately, hearing it on first blush. You know, you have to cultivate the kind of critical intelligence requisite to be the kinds of agents of change that we need. And that requires, I think, something different, something more of us. And that is, we have to always engage in a kind of cross-referencing, looking at information from a variety of different angles so that we can come to our own decisions. But I understand the question. One way to answer it is that we have to cultivate a healthy skepticism about what we're hearing. Whether you're an MSNBC watcher or a Fox watcher, right? You have to cultivate a healthy skepticism, but that skepticism has to be rooted in a practice of acquiring information from a variety of sources so that you could draw your own conclusions. So the short answer is don't believe anything at first blush, right? Yeah. Especially in the media these days.
Each time that I hear of another mass shooting, I'm overcome with grief.
Yeah.
And COVID and the impact that it had on so many people in their lives. And then each time, I think, for us here at Circular, as we go deeper and deeper with the racism and all the hurt and pain, it seems to me that there's a place for lamentation, for deep lamentation, because I can't help but wonder, without that, how can we be whole enough to move forward? So would you speak to the place of lamentation?
Yeah. You can't lament what you don't admit. We can't lament what we won't admit. Just think about South Carolina. Think about what y'all are living. Think about the people you love and the people you live with. Space for lamentation. Narrow. I suppose one way I understand what I'm doing is to create the conditions under which we could actually do that, to help open up space for a kind of lamentation, a kind of reckoning that will allow us to be otherwise. Right? Without sentimentality, though. Without sentimentality. I want us to be so much more. I pray that we can become so much more. But it requires So much of us. We have to tell the truth, no matter the cost, and then a bit more. Does that make sense? Yeah. We have time for one more. Y'all see, you see the moral stakes? It's not just about politics. It's the moral stakes. Yes, ma'am.
You've talked so much about how this is a country that has denied its history.
Yes.
And of course now we're in a period where there are elements that not only want to deny it, but make it illegal. Our school system is under attack. And I'm wondering, what do we do since education is so fundamental and foundational to moving forward in any regard? How do we educate our children if all our systems of education are co-opted to, adverse purposes?
Thank you for that question. Mark Twain said history might not repeat, but it damn sure rhymes. At least they said he might have said it. At least they think he might have said it. This is exactly how let me put it differently. We've seen this before. So the Dunning School of historians at Columbia University are the first historians that begin to, William Dunning, write the history of Reconstruction. And they wrote the history around carpetbaggers and, the failure of giving these former slaves the franchise, putting them in control of government, and da-da-da. And that story, that historical narrative, set the ground for retreat, right? Justification for rolling back the aims of Reconstruction, right? Set the context for the emergence of the Klan, the justification of extra-legal violence, and the like. So history, right, is a central battleground for the political imagination, and we saw it. We're still, the South may have lost the war, but they won. They might have lost the war, but they won, or lost the battle, but they've won the intellectual war. Right? So we're still dealing with the frame of the lost cause. I mean, you guys are awash in it in South Carolina, right? I know we are in Mississippi. And so part of what we have to do is to understand, right, the stories we tell matter in terms of the kinds of people we take ourselves to be. But let me answer your question more directly. So going back to Ron DeSantis. DeSantis and his folk, remember, they came out and rejected the AP class from the College Board around African American studies. And the College Board bent, right? Tried to negotiate with them, redacted certain aspects of the course. And there was an outcry from teachers, from students, and professors. And now the College Board has gone back to the drawing board and has admitted that they've conceded too much to the state of Florida. What's the story? The story isn't just simply about the importance of history. The story is that we have to fight. We have to push back. And if we push back, we can win. We can win if we fight and push back. And I think that's important. As we see in Michigan, we see in Wisconsin, people are showing up to school boards, that the Moms for Liberty school board slates are losing across the country because those of us who have been too busy working in our little homes behind our little white picket fences are showing up to school boards now. Showing up at the school board meeting saying, you're not going to mess with what my children learn, right? And so the answer to the question is the answer to Virginia's question, which is the answer I've been giving all along. We have to fight for the world we want. Because if we don't, we will lose. And that will be a dark day for the country. Should we end on something higher, though? Something higher is my faith in you, and hopefully your faith in me, that you and I can imagine a world that's different together, right? So one of these days, we're going to play golf together. Somebody, and y'all going to hear me talk a little smack while I'm doing something. We're going to have to figure out how to create love in those intimate spaces, right? Where hatred festers. Does that make sense? Love y'all. Take care now.
Amen. So amen. And just a brief word of thanks to Eddie for being with us. This is a very busy time in the term. He got here yesterday, he's going back today. So your time with us really does inform us and inspire us for the work that we're doing. And all that I would add is that none of us are doing this alone. So we have each other, we're building community here, there are friends online, friends all over Charleston, and we'll keep doing the work in love and solidarity. And to that end, we have a minute, I think, to celebrate. There's still a book table, a few snacks. We want to be mindful of Eddie's travel needs, but let's take a few minutes and continue the conversation. Thanks for being with us, friends, and thanks to all who made this possible.